Hi, it's Angela Egan with Accelerated Learning. Today we are going to talk about writing. Let's get started. Let's go over some learning targets. Today we're going to talk about the key steps in the writing cycle and the foundational skills that support strong writing. We are going to identify and explain the essential components of an effective writing lesson. And then we're also going to review a sample writing lesson, and we are going to be able to take a look at each component that supports student writing. Before we get started though, I would like you to take a look at this photograph, and I would like you to set a timer for 2 minutes and write about this picture. At the end of 2 minutes, you can rejoin this webinar because we are going to talk about your experience. So pause here. All right, if you're joining back, that means that you paused, you wrote for 2 minutes, and now we are back to talk about your experience. What was it like writing about this picture? I just want you to reflect on that. Was it easy? Was it hard? Were you able to come up with ideas? Were you able to put words on paper? Were you able to write complete sentences? Is your writing legible? Do you have a lot of knowledge about this photograph? And it's important that we reflect on this experience because ultimately I want you to understand that if a student has limited knowledge about a topic, it can really affect their confidence. It can affect the vocabulary words they're using. It can affect the organization of their writing. And some of your students may not be able to put anything down on their paper because they do not know how to organize the ideas that are formulating in their brain at the time. Now, I'm going to just show you a passage. This passage is about that photograph. So you can take a few seconds here if you want to pause and read through this passage. But if I provided you with some background knowledge about that photograph, would it be easier for you to write about it? I'm going to assume that for most of us, it would be easier for us to write about the photograph after we've either read it or had someone read it to us. And now I want you to think about what you see here on this page. There are vocabulary words. There are some different charts to help you get the gist of what a story is mostly about. And then there's also a graphic organizer here. And these are really important tools because as you're asking your students to respond to a prompt, or if you're giving them a writing task, they have to juggle a lot of different things. They have to be able to describe details, they have to be able to come up with ideas, form sentences, and decide on the structure that they are going to have to use for their writing. That's a lot of different things. So if you had trouble writing about that photograph, it doesn't mean you lacked the ideas or, you lacked knowledge about that picture. As an adult, we're probably all very familiar with Newton's cradle, but we may have a difficult time putting into words what that photo represents. That's what it feels like for a student who can't yet write automatically. And that's why it's so important that we are providing scaffolds for our students. We have to make sure that we are highlighting key vocabulary words in our mentor text or in our readings. We have to make sure we're providing sentence stems, word banks, questions to guide them, and graphic organizers so that we can then free up some of that cognitive space so that they can focus on the meaning and the idea generation rather than just the mechanics. Over time, you can gradually remove some of these scaffolds, right? But we can't do that until our students have internalized the process. And that's why no matter what age or what grade level you are working with, scaffolds and structured supports are essential for writing instruction. And we're going to go a little bit deeper into some of those supports today. Before we talk about get into writing specifically, we have to talk about the foundations of reading and writing. And when we think of reading and writing, we think of literacy, right? Those are skills that we learn after we already know how to speak and listen. And the key word there is after, because oral language is our primary system, right? We were born to speak, we were not born to read. And that's why literacy is considered a secondary system, because writing builds on what we already know about talking and understanding speech. So when we think about the oral language systems, we're thinking about those building blocks that we use when we speak, when we listen, when we read, when we write. Each system is essential. Each system is like a tool for using language. So we have pragmatics. Pragmatics is referring to how we use words in social situations, knowing when to say, knowing what to say and how to say it to different people. Um, an example could be saying please and thank you, saying hello when we greet friends, or saying goodbye when we greet friends, thinking of those social situations. Syntax is referring to the rules of how words go together to make sentences. So instead of saying fast dog run, we say the dog runs fast. When we think of semantics, it's all about meaning, the meaning of words, the meaning of sentences, right? So knowing that if I said to you bat, if I just say bat, you're probably starting to form a picture in your mind. You may be thinking of an animal, or you may be thinking of baseball, right? You need more information to help you understand which word I am talking about, right? And that's semantics right there. Morphology is the meaningful word parts, right? So when we think of morphology, we're thinking about the parts of words and how we can change words around to form new meanings. When we think about phonology, we think about the sounds. We think of that phonological awareness umbrella. When we think of phonological awareness, it can be a little complicated, right? We have the word level, we have the syllable level, we have the onset rhyme level, and we have that phoneme level. Our ultimate goal is for students to be manipulating at that phoneme level. That means that they can segment the sounds in words, they can blend the sounds in words, and they're working on more advanced phonemic awareness skills, which include the addition, the deletion, and the substitution of sounds. Let's talk about our input and our output skills. When we think of receptive and expressive language, it's important to understand that our language competence relies on these skills. These skills are really the foundation for developing our lower level and our higher level writing skills. Receptive language involves understanding the spoken, the written, or the sign language input, right? So an example would be following directions, comprehending questions, and understanding stories or instructions, right? That represents that receptive language abilities. Now let's think about our expressive language. Expressive language is about using the words, the sentences, the gestures, the symbols to communicate messages outwardly. When we speak, we write, we sign, or we use pictures to convey our wants, our needs, our ideas, those are all forms of expressive language, right? It's the output. It's how someone produces language to share information or emotions. We have to understand language because that is going to support the ability to produce sophisticated and accurate written output. When we think of writing, we think of foundational writing skills, we think of text generation, and skilled written expression is really the product of both of those, right? So when we think of those foundational writing skills, we're thinking of transcription, right? The act of actually writing, right? Our letter formations, our handwriting, maybe keyboarding practice, fluency with writing, spelling, punctuation, spacing, those are all part of those foundational writing skills. When we're thinking of text generation, we're thinking of composition, right? We're thinking of our knowledge of text structures. We're thinking about the vocab, the sentence construction, those paragraphs, those genres, really the organization of our ideas. And just like we have a reading rope, there's also a writing rope. And it's really important that all of these components are embedded into your writing instruction. And just like you can see from this writing rope, all of these components really work together. We have our critical thinking. We have, generating those ideas, gathering information. We have that writing process, what we think of, we're going to talk about power in a little bit. When we think about syntax, right, we're thinking about how we put words together to form sentences. And to support us with that, we have our grammar concepts and skills. We have our punctuation. We have to be able to elaborate on sentences. We think of text structure. We think of our narrative writing, informational, opinion structures, a paragraph structure. Think about those paragraph frames. We think about transition words and how we connect all of that together. So it's with that organization. When we think of writing craft, we're thinking of word choice. We're thinking about the audience. Who are we writing for? We're thinking about the purpose. Why are we writing this? And then when we think about transcription, we're thinking about our spelling, our handwriting, and just really producing, being able to the act of actually writing. And so there's a lot that goes into this. And so after this webinar today, my goal is that you have a better understanding of how you can really integrate all these components into your writing lesson, so that you can effectively teach your students and support them with all of these skills. We have transcription and translation skills. Transcription skills involve the physical act of producing written language through handwriting or keyboarding, and that also includes your spelling, right? These are those foundational skills that we talked about when we looked at, when we took a look over here at the simple view of writing. And that includes some of the ways you can support your students with these skills are through sound dictation, word dictation activities, sentence dictation activities. These are really components that should be embedded within your small group instruction and your tier 1 structured literacy practices. You also have keyboarding. We have to explicitly teach our students how to use a keyboard and how to become fluent with that. Because as you know, many states, many districts, rely heavily on those state tests, and students have to be able to know how to use a keyboard in order to, answer questions appropriately on those tests. So it's a really important skill. And then we have that word automaticity. We want our students to become more automatic with their word writing. And then we have our translation skills. Translation skills really means the ability to turn your thoughts into clear writing. The key word there is clear, right? Because we know that sometimes our students are able to verbalize what they're saying, or they have an idea of what they want to say, but it's really hard getting it down on paper. And that's why we have to support them with these skills. And we can support them with these skills by supporting them at the sentence level, helping them write clear, meaningful sentences, right? We have to support them with the organization of their writing so that it flows logically. We have to think about how what we're verbally saying and how that can, translate and transfer to our writing. Translation skills enable a student to transform their language, their thoughts, and their speech into a polished written message that others can easily understand, right? And we want to make sure that our students are really automatic with those transcription skills, because when it comes time for them to translate those skills into writing, right, they have to be fluent so that it reduces their cognitive load on their working memory, and they can really focus on the meaning in those higher level tasks of translation, of turning those thoughts into ideas. And we want them to be coherent and organized pieces of writing. And so it's really important to support our students with both of these skills throughout the writing process. Now let's talk about macrostructures and microstructures. There's a lot of big words here, right? When we think of macro, we think of big, right? Let's think about that foundation of your house, right? We need to have a strong foundation. And macrostructures refers to the overall organization and the big ideas of a text, right? It's how our writing is planned and how our writing is structured. Think of that text structure, the organizational pattern of a piece of writing. So what does that mean? That means that we're explicitly teaching our students about narrative writing, informational writing, opinion structures. They have to know the structure. And then we also have to teach them about story grammar, right? The essential components, what we include in a narrative writing, right? We have characters, we have settings, we may have problems and solutions. We also have to support them with the overall argument or purpose. Why are you writing this? Who is your audience, right? Those are all things that they have to be thinking about so that they can have that strong foundation. Macro structure really dictates how all of the paragraphs are assembled to form a unified, coherent whole. And then when we think about our microstructures, we're talking about the small parts of writing. So, right, if we're thinking about the microstructures, we're zooming in, we're in the inside of our house, right? So we're thinking of those words, those phrases, those sentences that make writing clear and easy to follow. It's about those details that help ideas connect and make sense. So we're talking about sentence fluency, right? We have to have varied sentences, right? Variety of simple, complex, compound sentences. We're thinking about the word choices that we're using. We're thinking about those we're thinking about the different transition words that we're using to connect ideas. We're thinking about grammar, punctuation, spelling. It's all of the essential things that you need to build a complete sentence, which will then lead to building a single paragraph, right? So it's the structures inside of the home, all those little details that we need that are going to become part of that bigger picture, which would be your macro structures. And just an example of what that may look like during a lesson. So if you're in the planning stage, right, you have to decide on your main ideas, your overall organization, right? What is your text structure going to look like, right? You're developing that big picture. So, maybe it's an outline. Maybe you have a story grammar chart or an organizer, right, that shows that big picture. And the microstructure would be thinking about your paragraph focus and your sentence variety. What is each section going to look like? When you're drafting, right, you're writing your initial version of a text. You have to follow a plan. You need a structure for your paragraphs, right? Maybe a paragraph frame, maybe an organizer like Tide, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. And then you have clear sentences, right, with transitions and correct grammar. We have to connect all of our ideas so they fit into that structure. When we're revising, we're improving our content organization, right? With the check if our ideas flow logically. Do our paragraphs have a clear purpose? And the level of the microstructure, does it make sense? Do our sentences, make sense? Do we have to include any new components based off of our revisions? Are we missing any pieces? When we're thinking about editing, we're thinking about our grammar, our spelling, our mechanics, right? So the role of macrostructure is overall, does it make sense, right? Is the coherence intact? Do we understand what this piece is really about? And the role of the macrostructure is to really zoom in on the grammar, right? If you've explicitly taught phoneme, grapheme correspondences, your expectation is that it's going to show in your students' writing. Do they have correct subject verb agreements in their writing? Those are things that you would look at the micro level. And then when we publish and share, right, we want to present our writing. We want to make sure that we present it in a clear, organized way so that the people who are listening are able to understand the overall text. And then the readers, if you're reading it, then you can also follow along. And then at the micro level, we just want to make sure, do our sentences sound smooth? Are they polished? Do they connect the ideas in a way that ultimately makes sense? So as you can see, those transcription and translation skills directly relate to those macro and micro structures. These are all the essential components, and it's really the foundation of what is going to lead to strong writing. Now I'm going to take a second. I just want you to reflect on your students, reflect on your classroom. What do you notice? What are your students doing during writing? I personally know that as I've looked around a classroom of students, I've seen a lot of different things. I've seen students who are writing. I've also seen students who have their heads on their desks. I've seen students who are kind of sitting there staring into space. I've seen students who are tapping. I've seen students who have nothing on their paper. I see behavior issues. I see students who are acting out because they don't know what to do. So these are pretty common things that happen during a writing block, right? I just put down a list here of what you can see or what you may see in your classroom. And if you don't see that, well, that's pretty impressive. Share your ideas with us. But it's not uncommon to see these things, right? And so these observations highlight common barriers, right? When we think about writing, writing is very taxing on the brain, and it requires a lot of mental supports. It requires a lot of direct instruction. And we need to make sure that if we are observing any of these things in the classroom, that we are providing supports for our students to really be able to reduce their cognitive overload and support them with all levels of writing so that they can be successful writers. And so a lot of those things that you're noticing are because our students really need support with their executive functioning skills. And now when we think of executive functioning skills, we're really thinking about how we plan, how we organize. We're thinking about our persistence. We're thinking about our working memory, because writing is difficult, right? And we know that even as adults, writing can be difficult if you have to write about a topic you don't know a lot about. Or it's difficult if you just don't know how to organize your writing. It requires complex mental skills, and they all have to work together. And so when we think of those executive functioning skills, we're really thinking about how our brain processes that help us to plan, organize, remember, and control our thoughts and actions. So when we think of our working memory, right, this is our mental workspace. When we're writing, students have to keep all of these ideas, words, and things in their brain, and writing can be very taxing on the brain, especially when they're required to do, tasks simultaneously. which can lead to less organized work, slower pace. Students have to plan, they have to organize before writing, and they have to decide what they're going to write about. Do they have enough ideas to be able to write about this topic? So we really have to support them with setting goals, with creating writing plans, support them with these skills so that writing feels less confusing and they can be more confident with these skills. And then initiation and persistence, right? We know that writing is a challenge. Students have a hard time being persistent, and executive function skills can really help them to stay focused and develop good writing habits so that they are less distracted, less frustrated, and more excited and eager to write. So how do we support them with these skills? Well, we have to build routines and habits, right? We have to establish daily routines and consistent task sequences to promote organization and reduce overwhelm. Using checklists, to-do lists, breaking down writing tasks or assignments into smaller, manageable steps, using visual lists so that your students can physically check off when they complete a task. Simplify and chunk instructions. It may seem simple, but some students need you to break it down sentence by sentence, word by word, paragraph by paragraph. You have to figure out what works best for your students. There's also a lot of fun games that can support your students with executive functioning skills, and I'm going to share some of those games next. And then create a supportive environment, right? Have an area where all, materials are for the writing process. Maybe you have timers, maybe you have charts. Really create an environment where your students want to work, where they can feel successful. So executive function, and there's lots of games that can support your students with these skills. And these are very common games. Simon Says, chess, checkers, memory, matching games, Jenga, Uno, Scrabble, Go Fish, Connect Four, Dominoes, Pictionary, red light, green light. And on the right, you see how they support executive functioning skills. So maybe your morning meeting's a game. Maybe your Fun Friday. Maybe you're strategically incorporating some of these games in your Fun Friday or into your indoor recess bin. Because you know it's going to support your students with their executive functioning skills. And your students may not realize that, right? But make it fun and support their learning throughout that process. There's easy ways that you can incorporate these throughout the day. And so I highly encourage you to either get some of these games or go into your tag sale groups, find some of these games because they'll really support your skills, your students' skills in and out of the classroom. All right. Now we're getting into writing. When we think about the writing cycle, right? We know writing is a recursive process. Writers move through stages in a flexible order, often going back and forth. The key stages are pre-writing, our thinking, our planning, right? This is where they're preparing before they're putting words on the paper, brainstorming ideas. Then we have our drafting, right? Where we are focusing on getting ideas down into sentences, not really worrying about perfecting it, but making sure that we're transforming ideas into language, which is that translation, which involves those translation skills. And then we talk about revising, right? We're focusing on improving our content in our organization. So we ask ourselves, does our writing even make sense? If it doesn't make sense, we have to go back and figure out where it doesn't make sense. And we have to maybe think about maybe our word choice, our word order, maybe think about syntax and how we can make our sentences make more sense. Is your information clear? Is it in a logical order? Does it make sense? Can my reader follow along? Are my ideas developed well? Do I have to add more details? And so when we're thinking about revising, we're really thinking about rearranging, adding, or deleting parts to improve the flow and the clarity. And then editing is really about those mechanical components. So here's where when we edit, we fix our grammar, we fix our punctuation. We're really polishing the text so that we can then publish it and share it with others. And you want to make sure that as you move through this writing cycle that you provide your students with opportunities to share their work either with their peers, with their families, invite the families in. Because you want them to recognize all the hard work that they put into their writing pieces. And here's just a visual that goes along with helping you understand that writing is a recursive process. It is not linear. It doesn't move straight from pre-writing to publishing. So that means every week you're not going to be following these steps in order. Sometimes you have to brainstorm again for ideas. Hemingway wrote 14 drafts of one paragraph in Old Man the Sea. Revision may be needed even after you've published. You may need to go back and revise. You may need to edit again, right? The writing process is really cyclical, and so it's important to understand that as you're moving through this process, it is not linear. So now that we've talked about the writing cycle, we know those components. So what does that really mean? How are we going to move through those components on a regular basis? And so the writing framework is what's really going to help you to understand the writing cycle. So we think of POW for our younger grade levels, right? So P represents picking your idea, you're deciding what to think about, what to write about, you're thinking about your prompt, you're brainstorming ideas, right? That's really that preparing part. You're organizing, right? You're planning, you're organizing your notes, you're planning your ideas. Um, we often use a graphic organizer to decide and to help us organize these ideas. And I'll talk about some of those organizers in a few minutes. And then we write and we say more, right? That's our, thinking about our drafting. We use our plan to write our draft. We may have to, make sure that our writing is clear, make sure it's complete. And so that you can use that for your younger elementary grades. We add the E and the R for our older grades, right? So we think of the editing and then we think of revising, right? So we have to check for mistakes in our spelling, grammar, and punctuation. We also have to make sure that we're revising. Are we making improvements by adding, changing words and sentences? So in a little bit, we'll talk about how we can use a rubric and we use some color coding as we're supporting our students with our revising process to make sure that they're including all the essential components of that text structure. And then we support them with that revision process. And then, as I mentioned, to support our students with that organizing section, right, with the planning of their ideas, we have to provide them with supports. And graphic organizers are a perfect way to do that. And so, if you're familiar with ThinkISRSD, you know that they use Tide. Tide, many people use it for informative writing, but it can also be used for different types of writing as well. You want to make sure you're not overloading your students with different mnemonics, but you want to make sure you're choosing effective ones. And this one there's been extensive research done, and it's highly effective. So this structure really helps you organize the content of your paragraph or your essay. So your topic sentence starts with a sentence. It tells what your writing is about. The I represents your important evidence or your idea. You're giving a reason or example that supports your topic. Your details are adding more information, explanations. And then your ending is you're finishing with your conclusion, your closing sentence, you're wrapping up your writing. So power helps us to understand that overall framework, right? That writing framework, it helps us to understand the cycle that writers move through. And then tide is what we use to organize our writing, right? It supports our students with making sure they have the all essential components of the text structure, right? It's supporting them with those macro structures. And then together, when we have tools to support our students with our writing, it's going to make writing easier and your students are going to be more successful. If you want to stretch, take a little break here. When we do, take a minute, walk around, and then come back. We're going to get into components of a lesson. So you can pause here and hop back in whenever you need to. When we think of the components of a writing lesson, we have to go back to that writing rope because we know that there are several components that are really integrated into one another. And how do we do that, right? We know that writing really hasn't been given the attention it deserves. We know that we only have a certain amount of time during our literacy block. So how do we get through all of this? And I'm going to help you understand that now. So what should a writing lesson include first? So we know it's recursive. We know that students are going to go back and forth through stages. They're going to be revisiting tasks to improve their work. But we also know that students need a clear scope and sequence for grammar. We have to teach specific grammar skills step by step. And we can't just teach a skill and then forget about it. There are some programs out there that have you teaching skills in the first month of school, and then guess what? You don't revisit those skills. Not going to work. We have to revisit grammar during drafting and revision. We have to have anchor charts. We have to put the skills that we're teaching on an anchor chart. We have to refer back to those anchor charts so that our students are constantly reminded to incorporate that within their writing. If you are sending worksheets, grammar worksheets home, if you're having your students complete grammar worksheets, please stop, okay? Because it's wasting time, it's wasting paper, it's wasting your energy. Grammar should really be embedded into their writing practices. And then we also know that students need during writing. We know they need to be able to regulate their emotions. And that's where the self-regulated strategy development comes into play. That's where we're going to help our students set clear writing goals. At first, this may look like a whole class goal, right? What do you want our students to be able to do during this writing lesson? Set a goal, write the goal on the board, have your students practice saying that goal throughout the lesson to help them regulate their emotions. And after you've done it as a class several times, then have your students start creating their own goals based off of their writing. And then we know that we have to incorporate the writing cycle into our writing lessons daily. So that means we are either planning, we're organizing, we're writing, we're editing, or we are revising on any day. So these are all the components that should be included within your writing lesson. So now when we think about grammar, right? What is grammar? Well, it's a system of rules and a language. It guides how words are combined to form phrases and sentences, right? Topics can include, understanding adverbs or understanding homophones, understanding sentence stems, verb tenses, punctuation, right? The whole point of good grammar is that we're explicitly teaching our students how to make communication clear so that whoever picks up our writing is able to understand it with its intended meaning. So students need regular opportunities to apply those concepts and skills into their own writing. Um, and as you can see here, this is like a grammar scope and sequence for grade 2. If you go onto my website, you can access free grammar slides for grades K through 5. And there's digital slides that go along with each of the different concepts and skills. So it's important that if you're not sure, where to start with your students, if it's the beginning of the year, you're going to start with the beginning skill. It may take a couple days. You may need more than a couple days. And then you move on to the next skill, but you're constantly going back to the previously learned skills and make sure they're applying it in their work. And then we talked about how self-regulated strategy development is really important in the writing block. So, it's an instructional approach that's used for teaching writing. It helps students learn both effective academic strategies and self-regulation skills. This method is supported by decades of research and is designed to move students from teacher-supported learning to independent mastery. Key features of SRSD include explicit teaching of writing strategies. We cannot assume that our students already know how to do these things. If we are not consistently seeing these strategies and tools being used in their writing, they need support with it. They need direct instruction and self-regulation skills such as goal setting, self-monitoring, self-instruction or self-talk, and self-reinforcement. And then just a focus on making students aware of the learning process, right? And making sure that we're giving opportunities for them to apply their new learning to their writing. And there's 6 stages to the to self-regulated strategy development. We have activate it, and that's where we're really building genre knowledge. We have discuss it, and that's where we're showing exemplars. We are talking about strategy use, developing goals, thinking of that do what section of our lesson. We're breaking down the prompt. And then we have model it, and that's where we're planning, we're drafting, we're revising, we're editing, we're showing them how to do it. Memorize it means, memorize it is where we're thinking about those mnemonics, right? We're helping them internalize those self-talk statements. Support it. We're providing scaffolds. We're providing, practice with those graphic organizers. We're giving them immediate feedback. We're providing sentence expansion opportunities. And then we're providing opportunities for our students to apply their new learning. Students, this is a really important stage because we have to make sure we're providing our students with ample opportunities to apply their new learning. They need that consistency of those structures and routines. They need daily repetition. That's what's going to lead to student success. Here's an example of just some executive functioning some self-statements that can support your student through executive functioning skills. So for goal setting, maybe it's my goal is to write a clear paragraph or sentence, or maybe you're going to make sure every part of your writing has a purpose. Make sure you're including, all the components of TIDE. When you're planning, maybe you're going to focus on just your main idea. Maybe they're going to make a list. Maybe they're going to focus on those details. Self-monitoring. Am I using transition words to connect my ideas? Have I included enough details? When we're thinking of self-instruction, if I get stuck, what can I do? If I'm overwhelmed, what can I do? Take a deep breath, right? A goal can be as simple as that. Maybe that's where you need to start as a whole class. Take a deep breath. Do one step at a time. Writing is overwhelming because there are so many steps to it, but break it down. Today, we're just working on our topic sentence, right? And help them work through those challenges. Self-assessment. I will read my writing aloud to see if it makes sense. I'm going to check for spelling, punctuation, and grammar. And then self-reinforcement. I am proud of how I used my plan to help my writing, right? Have your students practice these statements so that as they're writing, they refer back to them and they feel comfortable with using them. And you want them to be proud of their work because they're working really, really hard. And then we know that we need to work through the cycle, right? And so we have our writing framework to support us with that. That was a lot of information. Take a deep breath because now we're going to get into what a lesson looks like. All right, let's take a look at this lesson here. So first you have to prepare, right? So we have to create a question or prompt based off of your mentor text. So if I'm going to use the story Emmanuel's Dream, I created a question. Explain how Emmanuel is brave. And now, if you have a difficult time coming up with questions or prompts, you can use the depth of knowledge wheel to help you with this. And so you can kind of zoom in or you can Google search. It's really helpful because level 1 words really support recalling facts and basic info. Level 2 is where you're focusing on applying skills and connecting ideas. Level 3 is using strategic thinking and reasoning. Level 4 is doing extended complex problem solving, right? So we want to make sure that we're balancing the questions that we're using and the different types of prompts that we are creating. Obviously, as you progress through the levels, they become more complex in what your students are expected to be able to do. And then we have to do what? We have to prepare. So now we have our question, we have our prompt, and we're going to break this down for our students, right? So if you've seen some videos of Think SRSD, you have a lot of teachers saying, do what? And then they have their students breaking down that question. The do is your key verbs. What do they have to do? They have to explain. What is the task you're asking them to do? You're asking them to figure out or talk about or explain how Emmanuel is brave. After you've broken down the prompt, you can show your students an exemplar, right? So at first, you want to make sure your students show your students what an exemplar response would look like, right? So you're going to highlight the topic sentence. You're going to highlight the evidence, the details. You're going to highlight that conclusion. You're going to highlight the grammar concept or skill that they use within their writing. You're going to talk about the sentence level and how it makes sense, right? So you want to make sure you're highlighting an exemplar to show them what you want them to produce. We have to make sure that we're showing our students what high quality writing looks like so that as they're going through the process, they can, recall that information and start to incorporate that within their own writing. And then we have to help our students with picking ideas, right? They have to generate, they have to collect. What are they going to write about? How are, they have to first understand the prompt and then focus on specific actions or moments that are then going to show bravery, right? So we may have to support them with going back to the text, coming up with ideas, generating a list of ideas. If your students are struggling with coming up with ideas, then you probably have to ask them some guiding questions to help them generate those ideas. Go back to the text, get key evidence from the story. And then, a self-regulation prompt may be, does my idea answer the question clearly? And then once you've created a list of ideas, then you want them to choose one or two main ideas that they're going to focus on. Because then those are the ideas that they are then going to incorporate within the organizer that they are going to use for that text structure. If your students are having a hard time coming with ideas, you can support them with using a kernel sentence, right? So you're going to take a simple sentence and like he shows bravery, and then you're going to support them with expanding that sentence. Level 1 questions would be using words like what, when, and where for question words. Level 2 would be who, when, where, and why. And so depending on your students, you can depend on which questions you're going to have them answer. And so if the simple kernel sentence, he shows bravery, who shows bravery? What did they do? When did they do it? Where did they do it? Why did they do it, right? So you're going to move through these questions with your students to help them expand that kernel sentence, right? So this is a scaffold. If your students are having trouble coming up with ideas, you can support them by helping them, by giving them a kernel sentence and helping them with expanding that sentence. And then after your students have completed their expanded sentence, then we are going to show them, right, how to take those ideas and put them into a graphic organizer. So a goal for the planning stage could be, I know the steps. I'm going to focus and plan first, and then I'm going to write and check my work. And then as they're taking that expanded sentence, they're putting into their graphic organizer, right? You can highlight specific language that you want them to use in their writing. Think about those key vocabulary words. Think about those key words from the mentor text, and then you can have them incorporate that within their writing. Also think about your grammar concept or skill, because we know that that's going to be an important piece to also include in their writing. And that's why the next step would then be to then highlight your grammar concept or skill. What do we do first? We're going to explain what coordinating conjunctions are. I'm then going to show them an example of coordinating conjunctions in the text, right? And then together, we are going to combine two sentences from the text using coordinating conjunctions. So it's very quick, very efficient. And then the expectation is that as your students are drafting or writing their sentence, they are going to use coordinating conjunctions in their sentence. So the organizer is going to support them with then producing their draft. And they are including their grammar concept that you taught them, and they are going to include it in their draft. And then we talk about editing and revising. So once your students have their draft, right, here's an example of a draft, we're going to have them highlight their work. Let's do, it's common to use green for topic sentence. And then we can use yellow to highlight our important evidence. And then we have to highlight our details, right? So we use orange to highlight those details. And then we have to go ahead and do our conclusion, which can be red, but what do you notice? Oops, sorry. We just lost some slides there. What do you notice? They don't have their conclusion. So guess what? When they're revising their work, that's the first thing that we're going to have them do. So we're going to focus on revising our work, going back and adding a conclusion. Okay? And then after they've revised their work, and then you can have them edit for those punctuation skills. But you can practice doing this the whole class, having them identify the topic sentence, the evidence, the details, the conclusion, and have them practice highlighting, right? This is an important thing we want them to be able to do. And then you can have them go back and revise. Obviously, the revision's going to look different for everyone else, and that's why that immediate feedback and that conferencing and circling around the room is really important during this stage. This is going to take time. It's not going to happen overnight. As you are moving through this process, you need to do several collaborative writes as a class together. So plan out several writing pieces that you guys are going to do together so you can work through the process together. It has to be the gradual release. You have to do extensive modeling, work together with your class with some collaborative writes, and then your class will be able to start working on some of these writings independently. And then we have rubrics. Think SRSD does do the rocket ship rubric. When you're looking at the rubric, you can have your students really focus on that rubric to support them with their editing, making sure, did they include their capital letters? Do they have the correct number of details? Do they have punctuation? And then you can have them score where they fell within that rubric, and get them comfortable using that so they can see where areas of strength, areas of weaknesses, and they can use that to help set their goals for their next writing piece. And then once you're done, you're going to wrap it up. You're going to tell your students what they learned. You're going to explain, what they learned from the text, and you're going to talk about the grammar concepts or skills they embedded when they're writing. And you're going to let them know that every time they're writing, what good writers do, right? Go back to those anchor charts that you created, and then make sure you take time to share your students' work. They work really hard on their writing. We know it takes a lot of energy, so make sure you either pair share or find opportunities to highlight their strengths. So now you may be thinking about, okay, I understand that, but what if my students can't do certain things? Well, that's where we have to differentiate. We may have to differentiate the content. We may have to think about what students learn or write about. Differentiating content means, adjusting the material or topics to align with our students' readiness, interest, or background knowledge. We have to think about our students' interests, right? Think about the environments we're in and make sure that we're choosing mentor texts and books that really, that are high interests. When we think about differentiating, we also have to think about the process, right? This is how students learn or engage in their writing. So differentiating the process may mean that you have to vary your activities, maybe vary your supports. Maybe you're only focusing on, when you're expanding a sentence, focusing on the who and the what. For your scaffolds, maybe your students just need to focus on the topic sentence, and then you can gradually incorporate the other components into their writing. You have to think about what your students need. When we think about the product, this shows how students demonstrate their writing skills or what they're creating, right? So if your students, the goal is for everyone to be able to draft a response to the question. Well, maybe you have to tailor that for some students, or maybe some students are just at the oral stage where they have to record their oral response. You have to think about different opportunities and think about your students' strengths and weaknesses, and just to make sure that you're giving them all opportunities to be successful with the task. Thinking about your environment. Do you have a relaxing environment, right? Does the physical space, does the setting support your students with a calm and supportive environment? Is it an area where students can focus? Is it quiet? Do you have maybe soft music playing? Do you have, make sure your lights are on? Our students need to be able to see what they're writing and what they're doing. So you want to make sure the lights are on, make sure there's like light coming in so the sun is shining on them so they feel a little more alive, have a little bit more energy. When we think about when it's dark or dim, right? Usually, we get sleepy, and that happens with students too. So when you're trying to, differentiate or think about how you can support all of your students, you may need to combine one or more of these areas based on your students' needs, right? So you just want to make sure that you're providing as much targeted support as possible, because that's going to lead to greater student engagement. They're going to be more confident and they will be more successful with their writing. So we talked about a response to a text, right? Responding to a mentor text, using a clear structure and moving through the writing cycle with the framework. Now, what does that look like for genre-specific writing? Well, genre-specific writing, it matters, and it can be incorporated within that writing cycle. When we think about genre, right, we're thinking about that unique organizational pattern. We're thinking about those language features. We're thinking about our purpose for writing, which is going to guide how our students plan, draft, and revise. Teaching genre explicitly helps students internalize those patterns, and it will make the writing stage more focused and effective. Your students have to be aware of the different genre supports, so they can make deliberate choices aligned with their audience and purpose. And then genre-based instruction really promotes transfers of skills across writing tasks by highlighting how different texts are constructed, right? We have to make sure we're providing opportunities for our students to write for a variety of reasons. Now, your instruction should incorporate response to prompts, and it should incorporate genre-specific writing around a text. Here's where you have to make sure you're choosing highly rich content. You have to make sure you're choosing highly engaging text to support your students. You have to build your students' knowledge around topics. So what does that mean? What type of information do we want our students to know, right? What is important to our communities? What matters? So maybe it's social emotional topics like friendship, inclusivity. Maybe we want to focus on science and social studies standards, right? We have to choose content that is meaningful and that will build our students' knowledge around specific topics. So, for example, I chose Emmanuel's Dream, and then had my students respond to a prompt. But then I can also have my students create a narrative writing based off of this, right? Maybe they're going to tell a story about, a character and something, their character encountered and how their character persevered. And that have to include feelings or events. Or maybe they're going to create an all about book. Maybe their book's going to be all about disabilities or perseverance, right? So they're going to have to gather facts and information and organize what they're learning. I feel like so often when we're thinking of narrative writing, informational writing, or responding to text, like everything is in silos, when in reality, all of these components work together. So within, thinking about the mentor text you're using, with one text, if you're choosing high quality texts, you can read those texts for multiple reasons. And now, you know, maybe this week we're focusing on a narrative writing for a few days. And then maybe, we're going to have them do an all about book on disabilities. And we're going to read a different text next week that talks about, different disabilities, right? We have to choose mentor texts that align to the topic that we're teaching our students. And then we need to make sure that, we vary the prompts, the genre writing, so that it becomes a cycle of reading. We shouldn't be teaching narratives for the first 6 weeks of school and then teaching informative writing and then teaching opinion writing, right? When we focus on those structures as silos, we're not integrating it within what we're already doing. Why make more work for ourselves? So the genre specific writing should really be embedded into what you're already doing, because reading and writing, we know that they work together. So let's make sure our instruction supports that. So here's an example of writing style modules using genre specific compositions. So, you know, you can have, if your focus is on community, you can have your students write a letter to a local business owner suggesting a new service or product for the community. Maybe they're going to explain how to plan a community event, like a fair or fundraiser. Maybe they're creating a book about the history and development of your community. Maybe they're writing a diary entry about how they can organize an event or share an opinion on why local businesses are important for the community. Maybe they're going to write a biography or create an ad, or write a poem or a fictional narrative, right? These are all components of genre specific writing that can be embedded and aligned to your mentor texts. We do not have to teach these in silos. And on my website, you can download for free different genre specific compositions. It will walk you through the different examples that support these different types of writing styles, and it walks you through that explicit modeling approach of I do, we do, and you do, that gradual release. So now we've kind of tied everything together, right? So our writing lesson, what do we know? We have to have a high quality mentor text. And then our students have to respond to that text, but they have to respond in a meaningful way. And we have to provide that structure for them to respond to what they're writing, to what they're reading. And then once we build our students' knowledge, guess what? Now we can start writing about genre-specific compositions and teaching them about those different narrative structures and the different types of writing that fall into that narrative genre, as well as with informative and opinion. And then our students will see how these components are really intertwined and embedded within one another. Let's talk assessments. Before you even begin, I know it's a little, we're already into the school year, but, before you begin writing, you have to figure out what your students can do. So when we think of a pre-assessment, right, level 1 would be having your students write their name. We're looking at letter formation. We're looking at pencil grip, right? We're looking at their knowledge of the alphabet and sound through sound dictation. We are seeing if our students can write words and where they are at the word level. Are they writing words with CVC patterns? Can they write beyond CVC patterns? Can they write words with long vowel patterns? Are they spelling words correctly with long vowel patterns? Can they write multisyllabic words? What does that look like? And then can our students write? Can they respond to a prompt? And then analyzing their writing. And if your students are not able to respond to a prompt at level 1, that may just mean having them draw a picture or maybe write a sentence. Whereas if you think your students are at that level 2 stage, that's where you're really going to focus on that response to a prompt. So you're going to give them a prompt, and then you're going to have them plan their writing, and then you're going to have them write about the prompt, and then you're going to go through the process and you would check their work with them and have them reflect on that experience. And you also want to know what your students know about text type knowledge, right? So maybe you're going to give them an informative and a narrative pre-assessment. What do they know about these genres? So I created this one. This one is a multiple choice one, right? So thinking about your students, when we give our students open-ended questions about, text types, they may not be able to answer. They may not be able to have those ideas or the thoughts to put them onto paper. They may not be able to translate that information. So this would be like a basic level that you could walk through with them to see what they already know, get some ideas on what they know about facts and opinion, and have them circle the best choice. This would be done best in small groups. We know that, whole group of tests like this, students get easily distracted. So if you really want the best data, administer this in a small group. And then here's just another example that of an informative pre-assessment, maybe for the older grades, having them answer an open-ended question as well. And then if you think that your students are capable of responding to just open-ended questions about text type knowledge, you can do that too. But if you notice that they're struggling and they can't put anything down on the paper, you want to provide a scaffolded assessment, because sometimes our students can't put into writing what they can verbalize, and it doesn't show what they truly know. And we have to make sure our assessments are really reliable, or else we're just wasting our time, and nobody has time for that. All right, another type of assessment you can do, provide, is a curriculum-based writing measure. And this can be used as a formative assessment. And so basically you're having your students respond to a prompt. So if you did the pre-level assessment, you could then score it using a curriculum-based writing measure. You would count the total number of words, and numbers and dates that are spelled out, those counts as words. The title counts as a word. You're counting the correctly spelled words. Now, for them to be correctly spelled words, they have to make meaning. They have to be correctly spelled. They have to have proper capitalization. And then homophones would be considered an error. So if the word also is spelled correctly but doesn't make sense in the context of their writing, it would not be counted as a correct word. And then we have our correct writing sequence. Here's where we take a look at two adjacent words. And so if two adjacent words, if they make sense, if they have the right punctuation, if the syntax makes sense, the order of the words makes sense, if the initial word in the sentence is uppercase, then that makes sense. Then they would get a caret. So I'm going to show you what that would look like. So looking at this, hold on here, I'm going to open this up so you can see it better. So if you take a look at this this writing sample, right? There's carets, and then some words don't have carets in between them. So the, uppercase T, has a caret. Sun and the make sense. They're spelled correctly. Caret. Was, sun was. There's a caret spelled correctly. Was bright. Bright is not spelled correctly. They do not get a caret. Bright and are not spelled correctly. Do not get a caret. And worm. They were trying to spell warm. It sounds like it could be correct. Worm is a correct word, but it doesn't make sense for this sentence. So it does not get counted as a correct word, and it does not get counted as a correct writing sequence. And the same for worm and as. It is not a correct sequence because worm does not make sense in this passage. As Jen makes sense, uppercase J for the name. Jen walk does not make sense. Walk does not have the correct past tense. Same with walk and to and the park, park after. These are all correct sequences. School, she, they're missing a punctuation mark here, so she does not get credit for that. She saw, she is not uppercase S, missing the punctuation. She does not get credit for that. Her friends make sense. Friends playing makes sense. Oops, hold on. Oh, friends playing does make sense, but I'm going to have you try this part now. So I want you to go ahead and take a second and see if you think carrots belong, where carrots belong in between these words. So you can pause right here. And then when you're ready, you can unpause because I'm going to start talking about that now. So friends playing makes sense, so we'd get a caret. Playing on makes sense, it would get a caret. On the, a caret. The swings, caret. Swings and gets a caret. And then you would not have a caret here. and my video is blocking out that part for me, so I'm going to close that. So swings and hurry does not get a caret. Hurry is not the correct tense. Same with hurry to does not get a caret because hurry was not correct. To join gets a caret. Join them would get a caret, and there would be a caret at the end because that period, it ends with a period, and that makes sense. So this is what this is kind of the steps you would follow for a curriculum-based measure, right? So this is just one snapshot. This is not going to determine if your student receives extra writing supports, or it's not going to be what you're going to use to talk about writing with families, or it's one piece of data, so it's one snapshot. You have to look at other pieces of their work, other rubrics, other dictation, sound dictation or assessments to really get a whole picture of what your student is capable of doing. But this gives you a good idea of their writing fluency. And you should administer this maybe once in the beginning, middle, and end of the year. The overall goal is that their number of words they're writing improves, the correct words should also improve based off of the instruction they're getting with phoneme, grapheme correspondences. And then the correct writing sequences should improve as they're, learning those new grammar skills and concepts. So this gives you a good idea of their writing fluency and automaticity. Whew, that was a lot of information. So now we get to our next steps. What are my suggestions for you? So first, administer a pre-writing assessment, right? Administer a level 1 or 2 and see what your students can do. You want to ground everything you do in data, especially when you're doing your report cards. I know that, sometimes you're just like, click, click, like, well, I'm not really sure, but they can't do this. We can't be subjective in education. We have to ground everything in data. Our parents have to know where our students are so that they can support them as well. So administer a pre-assessment, administer a genre-specific assessment as well. Review the grammar scope and sequence for your grade. Remember, free digital slides on my website. And then create a writing prompt for your mentor text for reading. And then begin a power cycle. And then once you've built your students' knowledge around a topic, start incorporating those genre-specific compositions. If you need any suggestions or any help or support, feel free to reach out. I am for the teachers. I am for parents who want to support their own students at home. I, am passionate about this, so please do not hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. Obviously done extensive research on writing. I did attend the Pathways to Proficient Writing professional development, which was amazing. I also did a Think SRSD training, which was also really helpful. So a lot of great resources here. If you found this helpful, I would love feedback. So please feel free to just give me any feedback on this webinar, and then let's stay in touch. Please feel free to reach out. Here's my email if you need anything. I do have a Facebook group. My goal is to get more active and posting on social media, so keep an eye out for that. This is my platform, accelerateeducation.net. You can access the platform through this website and sign up for free resources. There is a free literacy curriculum on there for teaching language comprehension. There are free resources for small group structures and routines. So a lot of resources. Please feel free to check that out, and please reach out if you need anything. Thank you, and let's get writing.